This is dangerous.
The governing body has asked me to read the following announcement.
Ugh, God, no.
I'm Syran Warner. I'm an investigative reporter. And while I was setting up this microphone, I started thinking that it would be a good idea to say something about the ethics of what you're going to hear today. Because when this gets out, I think a few people may take issue with their contributions to the show. And these are valid concerns. No one had any idea they were being taped for a podcast when these interviews were recorded. And that's bad.
Ethics are, the thing about ethics...
A lot of the conversations you're gonna hear were sort of on background too, which isn't great. But this is really important, and the circumstances are extenuating. This is legal, and I'm the de facto ombudsman here at Cult Stories. Maybe look up your state's consent law. Maybe call the governor. Sarah Koenig might disagree with what I'm doing, but I don't know. You'd have to ask her. Here's what else I'll say. At this point, Genghis Muskox has been dead for 10 years. The paper that published a slim version of this has been dead for 3. And the archive is no longer online, so did it happen? Above all else, a man in Washington was arrested on several Class A child abuse felonies last August. The journalists in Okanogan County where this happened are fucking useless. You can print that. And I am convinced this will all happen again if I can't turn a few heads. So yeah, I feel just fine about breaking the rules this once. And, I don't know, you might want to grab a drink because we're going to ease our way into a long story. I just want you to keep ethics in the back of your mind.
I'm here to tell my story.
The great paradox of every cult story is that the closer you get to the beast, the more difficult it becomes to perceive. On the inside, it's hard to recognize that you're in a bind, and it's even harder to recognize what the source of that bind is.
So I am here to set the story straight. I am not in any way part of a cult, and there is no such thing.
That's Melissa. In her version of the story, she elides the part about leaving her life behind to marry an old man on the other side of the world. The reality of what she lost is still inaccessible in her mind. And if you ask Melissa who I am and why I'm so interested in her, the response she provides is, well, it's fascinating.
Actually, if any of you have heard of a cult hunter telling a story about a cult in Nikiski, that man, he is all wrong.
He must be one of those cult hunters. In reality, about 7 years ago, one of Melissa's roommates was a critical source in a crime story I was reporting on, and talking to her really altered my perception. It changed my life.
I had an encounter with God the day that I met Paul, which is the reason why I'm involved.
It's difficult to explain exactly, but I have a box in my office that contains a bunch of tape from the original investigation. And this being the first episode of the show, I thought it might be interesting to reconstruct that story so you can see how things went a little off course.
You know how we were talking about, like, what becomes your normal?
Yeah.
You know? Like, that was normal.
In here, there's a sort of line I crossed in the pursuit of finding an answer.
Well, what's the true story then?
It's a good question.
So, you're going to be manipulated a lot. You're not going to know which way is up and which way is down.
This is a story about murder, corruption, and brainwashing.
She's told me all kinds of stuff.
I know, but it's like, I think it's coloring the way you're seeing the thing.
In the summer of 2016, I was writing articles for an alt weekly in Minneapolis called City Pages. You might recall that at this time there was an election that was dominating the news cycle, and I was keeping tabs on that too. But my gaze was really fixed on a story about a homicide that occurred in Cooper Landing, Alaska, which is basically the middle of nowhere. There was a guy in that story named Genghis Muskox, who I was actually introduced to when I was a teenager. And he was very unusual, like a modern Davy Crockett with whiskey and hip-hop sprinkled in. Genghis dropped out of high school so he could solo kayak the length of the Mississippi River. He worked on a sheep farm off the coast of Norway. There are all kinds of stories. In 2013, when Genghis was 26, he moved from Oakland, California to Cooper Landing. His goal was to survive a full winter in Alaska and then go fly fishing in the spring. That did not work out. Genghis's life of extremes ended when he was killed by a friend he'd made in Cooper Landing, an Iraq war veteran named Paul Vermillion.
911, where is your emergency?
Killed somebody.
Okay, what do you mean you killed somebody? What happened?
What we're about to hear is tape from the investigation. At first, it will seem like a fairly standard piece of cult-free true crime before it turns into something else entirely. This will be presented as it was experienced by a true reporter. If you're familiar with the subject matter, you might just find the danger before it dawns on our flawed but divine host.
Have you heard about the cult she's in?
No. This is Cult Stories, Episode 1, Deployable Agent.
For about a week or 10 days, he was texting me a lot, trying to get me to go out hunting and fishing with him and whatnot. Didn't seem like that was something I wanted to do, spend a lot of time with him.
I spoke to Sean Parsons in August of 2017 inside the office of a resort and restaurant called Gwynn's Lodge in Cooper Landing. I had questions for him about his impression upon meeting Paul Vermillion 4 years prior, in the summer of 2013.
He had a strange relationship with violence, I would say. He had just a very different way of looking at things.
I mean, that was something that you thought before this happened?
Oh, yeah. I got the impression during that little, week, 10-day window with Paul that he was, in crisis. And my background is a little bit in psychology and whatnot, but I was considering going out with him and whatnot, but knowing what I knew about him and talking with people, they said shouldn't hang out with him, and discretion being the better part of valor, I decided not to engage with him because, I'm just a person.
Paul Vermillion had relocated from Anchorage to his parents' $500,000 vacation home in Cooper Landing just a few months prior to Genghis securing a rental agreement for a dry cabin that was a mile down the road. These guys were introduced to each other when a contractor that Genghis picked up odd jobs for won a bid to build a new garage on the Vermillion estate. When the job was complete, Paul invited Genghis over for a drink, and thus the basis of a friendship was established. By the time autumn came around, Genghis was a regular fixture at the Vermillions. We know that on the morning of December 4th, 2013, Genghis worked for a few hours before a friend from the job site dropped him off at Paul's. These guys walked to the liquor store, and then both Genghis and Paul proceeded to get absolutely shithoused. It's difficult to draw a whole lot of conclusions about what happened after these guys got back to the house, but the closest thing to an official timeline starts after Genghis's ex-girlfriend Jenna called him around 10 p.m.
I didn't speak to Genghis after he left Kenai until the night of the murder, and I called him at 10 o'clock and hung up pretty briefly. He answered the phone, and before he said hello, he had to stop laughing. And I said, "Hey, what are you doing?" And he said, "I'm pouring beer into Paul's mouth." And he was laughing. And I said something like, "Oh," I don't really recall how the end of the conversation went, but it was something like, "I love you, bye."
Paul made a drink and talked on the phone with his parents for about an hour. Then he called 911 and told them Genghis tried to kill him, and that he reacted in self-defense. Paul's story was light on details, though when pressed, he said Genghis was killed from a gunshot wound to the head. A lot of Paul's responses were very vague.
Okay. Where's the person now?
They're dead on the floor. So a trooper arrives at the scene, Trooper Miller. And as he's getting out of the car, Paul strolls out of the front door just covered in blood, and Miller tells him to stop. As the trooper got a better look at Paul, he asked if he needed to call an ambulance. But Paul assured him he had no injuries, and that turned out to be the case. He was just wearing a bunch of Genghis. Trooper Miller gets a little more of Paul's version of events, but Paul's account of the conflict seems to bend in whatever direction Miller suggests. When asked if Genghis threatened him with a gun, Paul says yes. When the question was raised a few minutes later with some skepticism, Paul couldn't remember if Genghis had a gun or not. The entire story Miller has to work with is riddled with inconsistencies like this. But what sticks out most from Paul's account at the scene are statements that come across as very cold and disassociated. They're just not what you'd expect from someone who recently had no choice but to kill one of their own friends.
Now, when we were walking up to the car, you told me that you executed him. That's kind of a strong word. So,
I eliminated the target.
Okay. And by the target or the threat, you mean Genghis?
At that time.
Okay.
I have no idea.
Okay.
I just, next thing I knew, survived, and I was ready to, go on to the next mission.
Okay, I want to pause for a second to review that tape. Paul told the officer that he executed Genghis. And then Paul stated that he survived and was ready to move on to the next mission. Further down the line, Paul's defense would find a decorated military veteran to explain how normal this statement was, given Paul's training. But there were some obvious holes in the logic used. First, this is a civilian conflict, not a war zone. Second, this guy talked about execution as if it was just like a regular old thing. I'll say that as a soldier, Paul never had the authority to execute anybody. They call that a war crime. And something else here, well, the decorated veteran used by Paul's defense also spoke to Paul's high character after, meeting him twice. The veterans who actually served with Vermillion in Iraq painted a far more troubling portrait of Paul's military experience. Here's John Diem, who led Paul's platoon.
There's a point where risk aversion becomes cowardice, and then there's a point where risk acceptance becomes stupidity. And for him, it was almost pathological that he didn't see the downside of using violence to solve problems. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Even if it was outside of common sense.
Were you surprised when you heard about Vermillion?
No, not at all.
No.
He just, he's one of those people with a character flaw that, just the right amount of stress and just the right amount of bad luck was going to break it open. He was just one of those people with a big crack in his moral compass, just waiting for the right things to kind of align.
There's one other thing I want to mention about Paul's execution statement before we go back to the crime scene, which is that a lot of people took this as a sign that the whole incident could be explained by PTSD. That's where I landed at first too, until I started talking to people who knew Paul before he went to Iraq and realized that if PTSD was a factor, it wasn't really the factor. One source who spoke to this was Paul's own brother.
Paul must have snapped because he was in the military. He saw things in Iraq and stuff like that. And she's like, no, Paul was a psycho before he went to the military. He was a psycho when he was in high school. I think he would have killed somebody anyways.
You really do?
To be honest. Yeah, I really do.
All right, back to the crime scene. So the trooper enters the home with Paul tagging along behind him, ostensibly with the idea that Paul will help him make sense of the scene. And it takes Miller about 10 seconds to reconsider, because there were weapons everywhere. Guns laying on the floor, guns leaning up against doors, a large ice axe in the entrance. It was for Miller's own safety that at this point Paul was placed in the car. Miller went back inside and started following an obvious trail to the nearest bedroom. I've seen the crime scene photos. I'm not going to describe them in great detail, but I'll say obvious stab wounds, obvious gunshot wounds. Genghis was on both the carpet and the ceiling. Fucking Count Dracula would have been grossed out by all the blood. It was gross. After seeing that, Miller cleared the house and drove Paul to jail. And while this was going on, a detective named Austin McDonald was driving from the other side of the peninsula towards the Vermillion property. While he heads to the scene, I'm gonna play a clip from a conversation I had with Craig Medred, who was the first journalist to write a feature on the incident.
Well, I don't think there was anybody here who had any doubt that Vermillion was guilty. I mean, the question, when I was involved with this, and I haven't been for a while, was that Vermillion is kind of really fucked up. I don't think anybody painted him as a hero. He's just fucked up. Totally fucked up. Whether the military did that or his family did that, I don't know. But he's clearly totally fucked up. The family kind of left him and, sent him to Cooper Landing and supplied him with lots of booze, and as far as I can tell, sort of warehoused him there, which didn't do anybody any good, and, who knows what the hell happened. The fact of the matter is, we know it's a pretty horrific murder. Behavior is just so extreme. It's just someone, emotionally disconnected and operating solely on, things you and I can't understand.
Detective McDonald arrived at the Vermillion's property on Snug Harbor Road in the middle of the night. His analysis of the scene determined that Paul overtook Genghis in the living room and got his hands on an ice axe.
We heard a yell, for, somebody, I heard a yell for help.
Genghis didn't make it out the door. He spun around, wound up on all fours, and the blood on his legs made the trail that Miller followed to his ultimate destination inside the nearest bedroom. Why would Genghis get so close to escaping his attacker and then head right back into danger? Well, the way the detective interpreted the scene, Genghis didn't have much of a choice in the matter. He determined Paul caught Genghis at the door and then dragged him into the bedroom. Paul left the room momentarily and returned with a shotgun. It was pointed right above Genghis's head, and we know from a blood smear left on the barrel that Genghis tried to push the gun away and avoid the blast. But Paul kept the gun steady, and that's where Genghis left this plane of existence. What had happened was an execution, just like Paul told Miller. Investigators found the most crucial piece of evidence when they removed Genghis's body. A hole in the floor beneath his head that turned out to have been made by a .30-06. This meant that even after Genghis had been killed, Paul Vermillion wasn't satisfied. He made the conscious decision to retrieve another gun and shoot a dead man in the head. A little further down the line, the second gun would become a hot topic.
But at some point, the ice axe was tossed aside and the shotgun was brought into the picture. And he was killed. And then Mr. Vermillion got another gun, the .30-06, went in and put another round through his head. And the ice axe, the shotgun, and the .30-06 used in combination suggests rage to me.
I'm gonna take a little detour off the path for a moment. So the man we just heard was Judge Carl Huguley. And in addition to presiding over a lot of the murder cases that occurred on the Kenai Peninsula in his tenure, he held the gavel for all kinds of divorces. And a few of those were really interesting. For example, there was this testimony, which came from a case that was resolved around the same time Vermillion's case came to a close.
What I remember, it was all spiritual.
So you never heard that he descended into hell and had some form of an altercation with Satan?
Not like that, no.
Have you heard that he had an altercation with Satan that he won?
Not specifically, no.
Have you ever heard him make a comment that hell itself is mine?
No.
Have you ever heard him make a comment that demons are mine?
No.
Could you ever imagine him making such a comment?
Not really, no.
Now that murder is mine.
No.
That's pretty weird.
I am not in any way part of a cult, and there is no such thing.
So where was I? I'm sorry. Yes, Vermillion looks very, very guilty. There was a lot of information at the crime scene that dismantled the story Paul told Dispatch. And the stories about his behavior in the weeks leading up to the crime that started spilling out of the community, well, they didn't help his case either.
At some point, I heard the story that Paul had pulled a gun on him one night after they had gotten in a fight at the same residence, and Paul was trying to eject him from the property. We were talking about it. I said, well, surely he has sense enough not to ever go back to that house, you know.
So you heard about this before Genghis got killed?
Yeah.
Okay.
And when somebody pulls a gun on me, I consider it a divorce.
Yeah.
I'm done.
Yeah.
And I guess maybe, it does get you get isolated up here.
At pretrial, Jenna Miller recalled hearing the story directly from Genghis.
And he told me, we were sitting at the bar, and he said, I have to tell you something that happened, and I wanted to wait to tell you in person because it's so disturbing to me. And I recall this conversation more or less clearly because it was also troubling to me, and he was clearly concerned for Paul. And
concerned for Paul?
Absolutely.
In what way?
Well, he told me that he and Paul had been hanging out at the Vermillion house, and they had drank quite a bit, and they had been sitting in the hot tub looking up at the stars and enjoying themselves and having a pleasant evening. He said that Paul went back inside and Genghis stayed in the hot tub. For some reason, Paul was inside and Genghis was outside. And when Genghis went back in to dry off and get dressed, Paul was standing there with a gun in his hand. And Genghis said that he had this look on his face like he was snarling. Like he was just full of animosity. And he said it was like a switch had flipped, like all of a sudden. Paul went from being a very jovial person and fun to be around to holding a gun, pointing it at Genghis, snarling, "Get out of my house."
It would be impossible to identify the catalyst for the violence perpetrated on December 4th, 2013. But that Paul killed someone while he was fucked up started to seem like an inevitability as sources accumulated. Paul's brother traced some of his tendencies back to childhood.
So for years he would call me at 4 a.m. He would call me and threaten to kill me. This is years before the murder happened. I was just I firmly believe he's either going to kill somebody or he's going to die young. And then
he killed somebody.
Yeah, and then he killed somebody. I mean, I can't diagnose, but I suspect he's either a psychopath or a sociopath. I think Paul's always been a dangerous person. Even when we were kids, he would just take things a little too far, if somebody tagged him too hard when we were playing tag, he'd push them off the monkey bars. He was one of the, he would just retaliate in extremes. Even if people meant no offense, he would take it offensively, and he would retaliate the perceived malfeasance,
Yeah.
Doesn't make any sense. He was always dangerous, and he's not evil incarnate, but I think he's always a dangerous person.
Something else that was briefly a factor in this case was that after Paul was booked, he was put in a cell with a prisoner named Bo Reed, and the two men talked about what they were in for, as prisoners are wont to do. I caught up with Bo Reed in 2017 after he'd finished serving what turned out to be a 3-year bid.
You can tell he's never been in trouble before. We met in a holding cell, and you can tell he ain't never been in trouble before. And like when I came in like shortly after he did. He was pretty panicked, not knowing what to do, and started talking to me.
Okay.
About what was going on. Then later on, he talked to his lawyer, and his lawyer advised him to, you know what I mean?
Yeah, not talk.
About everything. That's what he told me. It was basically an argument, and he went inside, grabbed his gun, and killed him. And he told me that he's got quite a few confirmed kills under his belt, and so somebody like that, they're just not going to sit there and, fight hands up and shit, you know what I mean? He's just gonna kill your ass, you know what I mean?
There were discussions about a deal where Bo Reed would testify against Paul in exchange for a more lenient sentence in his own case. But negotiations fell apart by the time Paul made bail. When I talked to Bo, it was apparent there was still some lingering bitterness over the whole ordeal. When he asked what happened in Paul's case, he was the first source I talked to in Alaska who didn't know. The 3 murder charges were dropped in a manslaughter plea bargain that was negotiated the night before Paul's trial was set to begin. I said it was weird because the gap in sentencing ranges was so vast, and that in this deal, Paul would only serve a little over 2 years in a medium security prison. Bo did more time for his robbery than Paul did for the execution of Genghis Muskox. I said I didn't really know why the state didn't take this case the distance, because no one involved in the plea bargain was talking, but that figuring out why someone with Paul's profile got a break was my highest priority. I just had to get someone to talk.
This is Kenai District Attorney's Office?
It is.
Okay. I was wondering if it's possible to talk to Scott Leaders.
What case is it regarding?
It's regarding the state of Alaska versus Paul Vermillion.
Okay, may I ask if you're involved in the case?
I'm just a member of the media. I'm from Minnesota, but I'm in Kenai actually now.
Okay, what I can do is I can transfer you his voicemail. He is at lunch.
Okay.
No one understands the art of luxuriating in a lunch break like Scott Leaders. They were never ending.
I can transfer you his voicemail. He is at lunch.
Okay.
When I picture the DA in my mind's eye, he's sitting by himself in the break room of the Kenai courthouse, and he's got this sub sandwich in front of him that's big enough to feed a banquet. Between tiny bites of this enormous sandwich, he listens to and deletes my voicemails.
Hello, this is Scott Peters at the Kenai District Attorney's office.
Okay, so we've been staking out Scott Leaders. We're gonna go across the street. Hopefully we find him at this next spot. Howdy, is your office open? How late are you open?
Till 4:30.
You know, is Scott here?
What is this regarding?
I'm a reporter from Minnesota. I called yesterday about a case that's closed now that he worked on.
Okay.
And I was just wondering if you had a second to...
Anything that is public record can be obtained from the court.
I've gotten that. I just wonder if he has like a statement or whatever on his decisions.
No. Anything that is public record needs to be obtained from the court. It is not going to come out of this office.
I truly still just am wondering from you, what is the injustice in the original case that you looked at between Muskox and Vermillion?
This is Sarah, a reporter I talked to in 2017. She has a podcast too.
Like, did something go wrong what went wrong in that prosecution exactly?
It was just a strange case because Vermillion was dead to rights.
What went wrong in that prosecution? It's an interesting question because from the outside there's not much to see. Vermillion's defense hired some experts to dispute the state's findings, but even with all their resources, the arguments put forward in pretrial were silly. It was stuff like, you couldn't prove Genghis didn't wipe his prints off the weapons, or maybe Genghis dragged himself into that bedroom. The prosecutor was afraid of this stuff in a case with a 25-year gap in sentencing ranges. That is, according to Genghis's parents. They flew thousands of miles, went to sleep expecting a trial, and woke up to this plea bargain.
Well, the one that I don't get in the whole thing was basically the prosecutor said he didn't want to go to trial because Vermillion was the only man left standing and he got to write the script on stand, right? Since nobody else was there. He said we couldn't prove there wasn't a struggle for the gun.
Or that Genghis didn't introduce
the gun. Yeah. Or, I mean, at one point they were even saying Genghis might have reached up there and pulled the trigger himself accidentally. You know, I mean, this is the sort of stuff you have to listen to at trial. But then, then they accepted a plea agreement. And that's why he said he accepted the plea agreement, because they didn't feel like they could win at trial.
With the jury. They could not.
Yeah, he didn't feel confident he could convict at trial.
Right.
But he didn't really spell out whether he didn't feel confident he could convict first or second degree murder or manslaughter or any of it. But anyway.
So imagine if you were on the jury and you'd just been shown photos of someone who was in such bad shape that the detectives were unaware he'd been shot in the head with a rifle until they found the hole in the floor. Imagine you'd just heard from witnesses who said things that were similar to what you've already heard in this episode. And then imagine from the other side you heard, well, maybe Genghis shot himself. I think I would find that patronizing. Of course, it doesn't really matter.
But then after they accepted the plea agreement, then Vermillion admitted to an Army shrink that he did introduce the gun. There was not a struggle for the gun, and that came out in the hearing, the sentencing hearing.
So the explanation for taking the deal was that the prosecutor didn't think he could prove that Genghis didn't introduce a gun that he never had possession of. Is that right? Since none of the officials in the deal would talk, I started moving through alternative channels, looking for answers. In the case file, there was a third party who wasn't involved in the bargaining process, and she seemed like a safe bet.
I think they had a viable case even though they didn't view it that way. And so...
Were you representing on this case? I'm sorry to cut you off. Were you representing on this case before the...
Before the deal, yeah.
Okay.
I still think that they had some really good evidence and arguments to go to trial. I mean, somebody was killed, murdered, and it just seems like, I don't know, I was surprised. I mean, that's all I can basically say. I was surprised.
This is Taylor Winston. She was with the Office of Victims' Rights when I talked to her a few months after Paul was sentenced back in 2016.
And I know that office is under a ton of stress and that they have more cases than they can prosecute.
But that's a weak excuse because, I mean, I was a prosecutor and I know how the hours I kept, and they were long. I was in the department for 13 years, and it was always busy. But it's not insurmountably, I mean, it's not, if you're going to start to whittle in your resources, generally you look at the kind of the lower hanging fruit, the misdemeanor crimes, maybe, some of the property crimes, or, first time offender type thing. You don't start shortcutting the murder cases.
Plea bargains are very common, but cases like this, where the highest risks live in the recidivism rates and mandatory minimums, those aren't the kind of cases that are supposed to go to plea.
the deal came about, wow, I mean, this wasn't on the horizon at all. It came, just kind of last minute on the brink of trial that they did this. And and they did it. I mean, it seemed like a huge drop in the case. I mean, from the murder one down to the manslaughter.
When the powers that be won't talk and you can't get an answer, anything is possible. The deeper I went into this story, the more it became about a bug in the system.
System gets corrupt over many years, which I think has happened here.
Mm-hmm. I started looking at other cases and calling other attorneys on the peninsula. And some people told me that focusing on a plea bargain was a waste of time since they're sort of industry standard. But I didn't pay much attention to that stuff. I just continued ahead in whatever direction the story was breaking.
Just, you name it, I saw it, nothing was shocking to me anymore.
So, during a conversation with Genghis's parents, I found out that the decision to deal the case wasn't on Leader's shoulders alone. The head of the criminal division for the state of Alaska, a guy named John Skidmore, had apparently given the decision his blessing before it was reached. I talked about this with a defense attorney named Andy. This guy was one of my favorite sources because he always spoke his mind. He didn't waste my time with performative bullshit when we talked about leaders.
He's a weasel.
I told Andy I felt like the news about the head of the criminal division was just another feature of the court system that allowed decisions to be made without anyone taking responsibility for a controversial ruling.
Yeah, Skidmore is over Scott Leaders.
And I guess that becomes important on just a national level because typically a district attorney acts with autonomy.
Yes. This goes back to what I was saying the other day, though, about what we don't have elected DAs. And that, I think that's a story right there. Because Scott Leaders, in any other state, you don't bring shitty cases. Because you don't want to lose, because if you lose, it's a black eye and you're not going to get reelected.
Yeah.
So you don't bring a case unless you know you can win it. If you lose a case, you're going to get called on the carpet. And there's an accountability in other states where they have elected DAs that Alaska doesn't have, because no one's ever going to fire Scott Leaders.
Yeah, he couldn't lose an election.
I've won a ton of trials in Kenai, and I don't think it's because I'm some great attorney. I think it's because they brought a lot of really shitty cases.
Was this a shitty case brought by an incompetent DA? Or was there something else going on in the state of Alaska versus Paul Vermillion? Alright, here's another skedaddle down a rough trail. Andy, the lawyer I just talked to, spends a lot of his time at the Kenai courthouse, so he was privy to the metaphorical smoking circle. Maybe the stenographer talked, maybe it was the clerk. I never asked. Someone probably said something like, "Man, you'll never believe what's going on in this divorce."
And did he describe an altercation with Satan himself?
Yes.
What did he tell you about that?
He said he stood before Satan in his throne room, and he said, "You can do whatever you want." He told Satan, "You can do whatever you want. I'm not going to deny Christ." And he said he spoke in Satan's tongue and spoke against Satan, and Satan kicked him out.
Did he characterize that as a victory or a defeat for himself?
It was a victory.
So he defeated Satan?
Yes.
Keep in mind, I still know nothing about this stuff as I start broadening my horizons. You get used to the idea that the answer is coming at some nebulous stage in the future, and you further your scope until everything is answer adjacent. I was on the phone with someone from the peninsula virtually every day.
I don't know if you've noticed this about Alaska. I don't know how much time you've spent up here, but people get real weird.
I frequently heard stories about a network of corruption, good old boys, power and influence. Some people even said that the media was part of the racket. Now, I typically find conspiratorial stuff like that easy to ignore. But a lot of the folks who talked about corruption in the media were former reporters who'd left the Kenai Peninsula by the time Paul Vermillion was sentenced.
Because the media in Alaska, I find reporters out fishing with senators, fucking hanging out with the mayor.
In regards to the Kenai Peninsula, the beaver down there is, like a sinking ship.
Morris as a company is... I ran into things later that were egregious violations of journalistic ethics, and that's why I left.
Yeah, and I've heard that.
Yeah.
I was really interested in these stories because I felt like the articles about the crime were missing critical context.
The Ice Axe, the shotgun, and the .30-06.
And you just don't have a democracy if the media isn't holding its systems to account. And that's just how it is. Someone who spoke freely about this was a source of mine named Dave Haig. When I found Dave, he was posting his own court records online after a run-in he had with Scott leaders.
The thumb was even put on the frickin' media. It's valuable to have someone like you that's on the outside looking in, is because those of us on the inside, sometimes we can't see the forest because of the trees. My hope is you kind of understand that you may end up doing one story, but there's going to be, you mark my words, there's going to be another bigger story about how it was covered up at levels far above.
Another thing sources open to talking about corruption were saying was to follow the Vermillions' money. And they certainly had a lot of it.
In this case, it's different in that there's money.
Yeah.
Which is the big element to me here, that, the case clearly got handled differently, and it clearly involved the fact the family had money.
The homicide really started getting ink at the beginning of 2014, when Paul's parents coughed up his $1 million bail. It was a moment where a few heads turned towards their neighbors on the peninsula, because most of the time, $1 million means you're going to sit in jail until your case is resolved.
I think that had it been me,
you would have been fucked.
Yeah, I've been fucked. I would have gone to prison for murder.
The Vermillions and all the money that came with them operated by a different set of rules than the rest of us. There was also something about them that was just a little off.
And it was weird because when my mom called me to tell me about what happened, she said Paul was involved in the shooting. And I was just like, oh my gosh, is he okay? And she said, because she made it seem like Paul was the one who was shot.
Yeah.
And she was just like, oh, he's fine. I said, where is he? She's like, oh, he's at the jail or wherever he was. I don't remember. I was like, oh, was he the one that shot somebody? Yeah. Is the other person okay? No. Is the other person alive? No. It was just very, Paul was involved in the shooting. Like, very detached, very, I don't know, but even then she was trying to, kind of gloss it over.
I called around and talked to reporters who'd had a hand in covering the case against Paul. And a few of them told me that Vermillion's parents reached out when the case was active, but that Doug and Patrice refused to go on record. So what was the point of that?
So he did make some calls to me, and I can't really tell you what he said because I think it was all, off the record. But he definitely, at one point called me and just said some weird things about, Black Hawk helicopters flying over his house.
Yeah.
No idea what that's all about. And he's also sent me random emails since then that literally one said, "Hi, vitamin deficiency is the root of a lot of bad problems," and that was the whole email. So I don't know what his deal is, but there might be a deal there.
Yeah.
I just knew I was closing in on whatever it was. I had to be. There's a significant difference between gathering a court record and actually being in the courthouse for a hearing. There's also a difference between talking to a source in the immediate aftermath of the event and talking to that same source 3 years later. My goal was to find everyone who touched the story at the paper before I found it in 2016. I also had a few questions about why the manner of Genghis's death was never revealed in the news. It seemed like the opinions I got from the locals in Cooper Landing swung on the hinge of whether the subject did or didn't know about the second gun. And it didn't take long to develop a theory about the information that was missing when I talked to former employees from the Clarion, like Greg Skinner.
So Morris Communications is owned mostly by the Morris family. Billy Morris is the chairman and CEO, and Billy manipulates the news in his newspapers to benefit his other financial concerns.
Morris Communication was the owner of the Clarion, and that was the only newspaper in town.
So it wasn't a culture that I could do long term.
I mean, what Skinner described went beyond the newspaper. He said he thought many of the systems Alaskans depend on were too interconnected and sort of rotten from the top down.
The managing editor, shortly before I got there, he went and pulled the reporter's FOIA request about the fire chief's salary or something. You know, the mayor called, and, you know, there's too much influence.
Skinner went on to tell story after story about how the news in Kenai was manipulated by local politicians, how they used the local media to suppress information about failed policies and improve their reputations in the community. The way he described it, there was a mutual interest in maintaining an idyllic perception of the peninsula and sanding off rough edges of the news.
There was a baby that was murdered and buried on the beach, and they didn't even run this. They wouldn't run the story. You know, anything that affects recreational fishing in the state of Alaska. You know, the appearance of the town for tourism, you know, this sort of thing. Morris papers try to kill the news.
In one of the stories Skinner told from his early days at the Peninsula Clarion, a state senator got his hands on a story in progress. It had something to do with a bill he was sponsoring. The senator then made revisions to the piece and emailed it directly to Skinner so he could submit it to his editor. Skinner said when he refused and brought up how publishing that story would be an ethical catastrophe, he was told not to worry about it. It sounded like there were benefits for the journalists who played along with this stuff, too.
Managing editor at the Juneau Empire in 2008, the mayor taught him and his wife how to dance for their wedding. You know, it's just insane. They're not afraid to take meals. They're not afraid to take gifts, fishing trips, and, you know. And I think it's because of the type of person attracted.
These stories about a corrupt system were very important to the feature I was working on, because there were questions about the influence of the Vermillions. If what Skinner said was true, it didn't seem all that far-fetched to imagine that a plea bargain for a murderer with rich parents could have come with an incentive. What I was hearing were stories about a place where kind of anything could happen.
So we had the state senator example, and then the mayor calls the managing editor and says, "What the fuck is your reporter FOIA the fire chief's payroll?"
A Freedom of Information, a FOIA request, is a critical tool for any reporter covering crime or government affairs, but there are all kinds of applications. And it is a crime to pull a FOIA because they're very important to regulating a democracy.
Like, they want to know why somebody was fired. They want to look at their pay, right? This is all public information. And the managing editor went down illegally, because you can't, like, if I file a FOIA, that's my FOIA. It's not the editor's FOIA or the newspaper's FOIA. It's my FOIA. Managing editor went down there and pulled it.
Went down where?
Down to City Hall. It said, pulled the Freedom of Information request. Said, no, we don't want it. So
what year was
so
that?
what I'm saying is, that was 2012. So if you go look through the papers, 2012, look for the determination of a fire chief, I believe it was. And then in that, there was a FOIA request to get at, and it had to do with determination. So it's just that simple, right? The state senator rewrites the news, puts it in the paper. The mayor doesn't like a FOIA, he gets it canceled. I mean, what else do you need to know? Why is it so shitty? Why can't they get away with anything? Those two things right there. And those are true. I put my hand on a Bible.
Was it crazy to wonder if the kind of connection Skinner talked about could sway a murder case? When no one will talk, I mean, you follow the leads that are given, and this seemed like a lead. If only this story could be corroborated somehow.
The thumb was even put on the frickin' media.
Dave Haig talked about this kind of thing all the time, that's right. And surely I wasn't the only person with influence that Dave talked to about his pickle at the Kenai courthouse. This motherfucker was committed to the fight against local corruption in a way that was totally without parallel. I mean, there's a video of him getting tased by bailiffs in an Anchorage court when the judge wouldn't hear his case.
That's felony tampering with evidence, and because a trooper, an Alaska State trooper, was doing it with a prosecutor, it's a conspiracy.
The courtroom's closed.
And they used it at trial knowing it was false. That is another felony.
To the judge.
And I'm putting my fucking foot down. Taser. No! Oh my God! Oh my God!
I was less skeptical of Dave after that happened. And when I called him the second time, I asked him if he knew anyone else who might talk to me about this stuff. And it was obvious someone came to mind right away, but he wouldn't say who it was.
What I'd like to do is just contact her and tell her what you're doing, because she told me something that I don't know if she wants me to repeat, and I'm not going to until I talk to her.
I got a few hints about the woman documenting local corruption. Apparently, she was a prominent reporter who was still plugged into the system, but I still couldn't get a name.
There's a reporter up here that said some things that make what you and I talking about with Scott Leaders pale to almost nothing. And she told me, I believe in confidence.
It came out in the conversation that the secret source Dave was talking about had a keen interest in the Vermillion case. And there was no way I was letting him off the phone without telling me who it was. Now, they won't tell you this in J-School, but the most effective strategy in a situation like this is to present an air of authority while being very, very agreeable. Talk around whatever you want to know about without addressing it directly, and then you just wait for the data to slip out of your subject.
That's what I find.
The lady reporter that I was referring to, her name's Catie Quinn. She's actually from Australia, but she's the one that'll give your name to. We all need to kind of share what we have, because we may have stuff that is a missing piece for somebody else.
Bingo.
Here's KSRM's Catie Quinn.
Until recently, most of Alaska's economic and demographic data had to be based on Anchorage statistics.
In 2017, I was a frequent listener of news radio from the Kenai Peninsula, so I was thrilled when I found out that the source behind the scenes was Catie Quinn. She was easily my favorite reporter in the region, and her beat covered the justice system and Alaskan politics. Catie was plugged into the system to the degree that when she was having visa issues, Senator Lisa Murkowski wrote her a letter of support. Politicians flew in from Juneau to talk to Catie. Peter Machicki, the mayor that Skinner accused of interfering with a public records request, He was on the air with Catie all the time, only now he was a state senator. What was most important to me, however, were the trove of stories about the Vermillion case that Catie generated between 2014 and 2016. I fantasized about having the level of access Catie had.
Welcome back to KSRM's Justice on the Kenai. Here's Catie Quinn.
We're talking this morning with Kenai's District Attorney Scott Leaders. Mr. Leaders, have there ever been cases where you got a very negative public response?
It's interesting because it's who you hear.
That's incredible. I was very excited when Catie agreed to a phone call.
Sorry, I've got people over.
Some of the things that were said in the beginning of that call would work as dialogue for a B-movie about espionage.
I got involved in this for the same reason you did.
Catie made it clear she had information that would be valuable to my investigation, but she wanted to know where I stood before handing it over.
So I want to get a feel for, it seems like you think that there's someone behind something, pulling some kind of strings. I just have a couple minutes now, but I wanted to get a feel for, it seems like you think someone has an end game behind all of this.
I do.
Who do you think has what kind of end game?
I offered several names I was curious about, but always returned back to the Vermillions and the pile of money they were sitting on. Catie said she knew otherwise, but wouldn't say why. It came out that we had very different ideas about what the injustice was in the Vermillion case.
I'm looking at homicide that's obviously homicide that got pled down to manslaughter.
Buddy, whoa. Back up just 1 second there, but okay.
What do you mean?
I mean, whoa. You may have read.
Well, this was unexpected. I explained why I felt the way I did, and Catie told me I was thinking about it all wrong.
That same story gets told over and over again. Like what am I missing here?
Because it's an easy narrative to repeat, and people lock onto it and make it their own and repeat it again.
Well, what's the true story then?
It's a good question. And I will very seriously consider how and what to share with you from what I have. I will tell you, I mean, they're all just basing that off of the easy, simple conclusions that you could draw from looking at someone from, the 30,000-foot view or reading Metroid's article. And then you just run around repeating it like it was your own original thought.
But that's not the easy story. You know what the easy story is?
What?
The easy story is that Vermillion's family had a ton of money and they paid to get him off. That's the narrative that everybody gets, right? Like, right. We've all heard about O.J. Simpson. Like, that's the story. I mean, that's the easy narrative. I thought slam dunk. That's the story, right?
There's a lot that you're missing.
Well, I know
you've got a lot, but there's a lot that you're missing.
What was I missing? Catie wouldn't say, but she was clear that if she decided to tell me, it would change my entire perception of the case.
All may become very clear, or it may not. I'm not telling you no, okay? I'm absolutely not telling you no. My mind is completely unmade up at this point. But I have a very, very definite internal moral compass, which I need to consult.
Yeah.
I just stopped arguing at a certain point. That seemed like the smartest path.
I could potentially have a lot for you, okay?
This was all very confusing, and a few times I was knocked off my access, too. Catie sensed that I had known Genghis. I had to defend the integrity of my story against drinks I'd had during the second Bush administration, which made me feel a little compromised.
We weren't Facebook friends. We didn't talk on the phone.
The anxiety this gave me got worse when Catie told me that after we'd exchanged emails, she'd looked at my material online. And this was horrifying because at the time, the first result when you searched my name on CityPage's website was an interview with a former governor, which would have been in Catie's wheelhouse. but it failed to meet the professional standards you'd find in her stuff.
Which strain of weed do you think is most conducive to getting college students to believe 9/11 was an inside job?
I think it's an insult to say that marijuana would have anything to do with investigating 9/11 or John F. Kennedy to try to learn the truth.
When I thought about Catie reading this at the end of the call, my mind was just swimming.
I'm going to tell you right now, I could have a lot for you, but I need to take some time.
Okay.
Right? I could have the answer to every question that you've got, one way or another, but I need to take some time. So if you would give me some time, I will get back to you one way or another and explain to you, the fullness that I can at that time, why I came to that decision.
Okay.
I was up all night wondering what I didn't know, questioning myself and my motivations. In the morning, I was in a fog, and I got a text message from Catie.
I know Paul and his whole family.
All right. Catie had talked to Paul, who at the time was in prison, about her conversation with me.
Paul gave me carte blanche to talk to you, which is pulled to a T. Like, I got nothing to hide.
I had a lot of questions about the emergence of a central figure like Paul, especially since it came by way of this reporter who covered so much of his case. But at least now it made some sense why Catie thought he was innocent.
That's pulled to a T. Like, Paul has nothing to hide.
How well do you have to know someone before you can say their response to a strange set of circumstances fits them to a T? I was thinking, who is really compromised here? It wasn't worth broaching the subject, though, because I didn't get any answers and had to field a bunch of questions about Genghis again.
I'm pushing you as hard as I can to find out where you stand.
I wouldn't characterize this as a normal conversation, but you gotta consider the access that was at stake.
I have a reputation around here. That helped. I've been in many of later hearings. That helped. I called, and then his boss,
Skidmore?
every day, every other day, every week, yep, for better part of 6 months.
Catie talked about lots of valuable intel she could provide. She knew the DA and his boss in the criminal division. Plus, questions could be passed to Paul through Catie and then sent back to me. She even put an interview with Vermillion's parents on the table, the people I was most interested in. But there were conditions to that made me a little uneasy.
And when I talked with him, I was like, well, do you guys want to talk with this guy? And he was like, I'll talk to him. I don't, and he does might need some time to think about that. Patrice, on the other hand, what Patrice wants, which we both know is a very big ask, but she wants to see everything that you got, and she also wants to have the final say after seeing the finished product as to whether it can go forward or not.
Yeah, I mean...
And under those conditions, then she'd talk with you.
Okay. I mean, part of it I don't have control over.
I had to tell Catie why that would become a problem if I found out the Vermillions had something to do with the plea bargain. I put a few scenarios on the table of things that were possible if my intel was to be trusted.
You mentioned the word imposting conspiracy.
Mm-hmm.
Are you thinking that this is some kind of, the Vermillions have some kind of sway or power?
I mean, I have no idea.
This theory was deemed baseless on the basis that Catie knew the Vermillions, and she knew they didn't know anyone important. Not that there weren't important people who believed Paul was innocent, there were, but they didn't hear about Paul's case from his parents.
I talked to Representative Newman. Representative Newman was disgusted. And I'm going to tell you, if you're going to find any political connections in this whole thing, it's going to be through me, not through Doug and Patrice.
Yeah, bingo. I thought the media was part of the racket.
So again, what's your angle? Are you thinking, is this a story about how corruption led a rich PTSD guy off the hook for murder. Is that the line you're following?
I mean, there's a couple different lines I'm following. I feel like there is a media there's a media problem.
I ran through all the things that made me do a double take when I heard the Vermillions wanted final approval on my story. I explained why there were concerns about politically connected journalists.
You talk to somebody like Skinner, and it's like, yeah, they pulled this FOIA. Yeah, I've seen, senators change articles. I've seen...
Everything came out. I indicated that reporting on this story was very stressful, that even though so many things were leaning in one direction, no one would pay attention. And this is when the tone of my conversations with Catie started to change. When she thought about it, she agreed that things were interconnected. Catie started talking about corruption she was aware of, even if it seemed difficult for her to say that it was wrong.
Alaska is that it's one really big small town, and so we tend to care more about people's feelings and their personal well-being than we do the letter of the law. And that's just a general statement. It's not always true.
In the end, she told me she'd talk to Paul and ask if he was interested in telling me his side of the story.
Well, but I guess I don't understand why you can't just write to... Is Paul in prison now?
Yes. I mean, I can get...
Why can't you just write to him in prison and be like, can you give me a call sometime? And he might just be like, great. Or if you can use, what's her name, that woman, and see if she's okay with you saying you spoke to her and she can vouch for you.
Yeah, she's the key to talking to Paul and the Vermillions.
I thought Catie was the key to everything before I even spoke to her, and now that appeared to be the case. I felt like I was being guided by the universe. Catie felt that way too.
My dad lives across the fence from the jail, and at this point I went outside. It was crazy. There's a blue van there, and I see Paul.
Maybe God put Catie outside of Wildwood so she could see Paul at that exact moment. I used to think that kind of stuff was crazy, but I'd witnessed a few things in my life that were unexplainable, so who was I to say that wasn't what happened? At this point, Catie's interviews were going on hours and hours, and these were the kind of things we'd end up talking about. For a long time, I'd been an atheist. But when Catie told me everything happened for a reason, it put me at ease. I'd just moved, I was going through a breakup, I was having trouble finishing my story, and Catie let me know that she was someone I could talk to without judgment.
Sometimes I sit there and I think, you're not good enough. I think that almost every day.
Yeah, that's the voice of Satan. It's just flat the voice of Satan. And not to make it sound weird, ooh, Satan, that is just, there are two aspects, and the one is love and forgiveness, and that's God, and the other is accusation and hate, and, keeping all kinds of records of wrongs, and going to the past, and then running that out in the future, and fear, and everything that exists in that realm is, what we call Satan.
There were a lot of conversations with Catie about God.
I had an encounter with God the day that I met Paul, which is the reason why I'm involved. I know you said you didn't want to know, but I had an encounter that is up there with the strongest encounters I've ever had. In those moments where it's just, I know that I know that I know, and this goes beyond words, and it goes beyond reasoning, and beyond words, beyond reasoning, beyond, and when he speaks to me like that, I'm like, I'm in. I don't know what we're doing, but I'm in. Have you ever had encounters like that?
When I started having deeper conversations with Catie, I let go of all doubt. There were reasons to be skeptical of this very strange interloper, yes, and in my memory I was skeptical, and then it's like I wasn't anymore. I can't pinpoint a single moment where it changed. I just know that it did because I'm a reporter. The other thing was that Catie was remembering things a lot better at this point.
That stuff with leaders.
I've watched the police lie, particularly the troopers. But I've watched them lie in court, knowing that they were lying. I've watched leaders lie in court, with him and I both knowing that he was lying. That's that happened. I know that. Trust me, I know that.
This is what I was looking for.
That stuff happened. John Soha was shot by a trooper when the trooper had no business being where he was, but we weren't even given, I was going to submit a FOIA, and I was told it wouldn't be honored, and I said, well, that's illegal, and the trooper's response was, so sue us. I was like, well, what's that going to do? I'm going to sue the troopers in our court? No. I've sat in the courtroom and watched a trooper and a DA argue over lying to the judge. And it's like, I'm not kidding, I'm not exaggerating that at all. Then the trooper went ahead and lied to the judge, and the judge knew it and admitted it, but said it didn't really matter, and he said it at the trial anyway. You want to take that direction?
That's
the direction. You want to talk about how they've treated Vermillion, how the state has used what would be considered torture in any other place, in any other time, against Vermillion while he's been in there? That's an issue which maybe we could talk about.
If you would have told me that 2 months ago, I would have thought you were crazy.
When I say torture, I'm talking about stuff you've never even heard about.
I was ready to blow the whistle with the information Catie was feeding me. There was a minor issue with some of my sources recanting their statements when they found out just where the confirmation of their concerns was coming from, but those people had some serious problems.
I mean, I've talked to her a lot, but...
Have you heard about the cult she's in?
No.
Don't tell her I told you, but yeah, ask her about the religious organization she's a member of.
Well, she's told me that she's religious, but that's as far as it's gone.
They're religious. It's a cult where there's apparently penis washing.
What an unbelievable smear that was. Penis washing. Catie had warned me about Andy, and he'd just proven he could not be trusted. What seemed to be going on here was bonkers to the level that I wanted to know what Sarah, the reporter on the East Coast, thought about it. So I sent her the tape I just played, and I started telling her about Catie.
I mean, the woman that you listened to, that 2.5-minute clip, she's a news director. She's not just some civilian saying that the trooper is pulling a FOIA request.
Is it, and the little clip I heard, the 2.5 minutes or whatever, that she seemed to be saying, Paul has this whole other story of being abused in custody.
Yeah.
That, you don't even know.
When I say torture, I'm talking about stuff you've never even heard about.
And stuff like that. So I was like, is that where you're going to go next? Is to try to, figure out... Because she seemed to be saying the injustice was all against Paul. She seemed to be on...
Yeah, I mean...
Paul has been fucked here.
Paul? Yes, that sounded bad. No one should be tortured. But it was lower on my list of investigative priorities than the influential Murkowski-endorsed reporter these leaks sprang from. What I wanted to get across to Sarah was that Catie had the truth, for sure.
The Australian woman is, we're in contact. I've interviewed her now a few times. She's told me all kinds of stuff that I didn't know, and has really kind of built for me an idea of what Paul's perspective is and who Paul is.
I know, but it's I think it's coloring the way you're seeing the thing.
What was that supposed to mean? I was pretty sure I was seeing everything just fine.
I mean, you just need to hear what the reporters say. Also,
I'm just saying, I wouldn't trust reporters. I wouldn't base your story on what other reporters are saying.
This was May of 2017, and when I told Catie that I'd had a conversation with Sarah about this, and she just didn't get it, she was like, who'd you talk to about this? And I was like, Sarah, she's actually got a really good podcast. And Catie was all, how'd you get her on the phone? And I was like, well, between you and me, I'm actually a very talented journalist. And it was funny, but then it wasn't funny because Catie was having some serious issues at KSRM. She said the radio station killed one of her stories, that she was worried about her job, and extra worried because her bosses might be the kind of folks who would go through her data and try to blackmail her. This sounded like the kind of terrible situation that could blow the lid off everything. And it was in keeping with, all this other stuff I'd heard. So when Catie asked me how she could delete 15,000 emails, I gave her a little tutorial and explained metadata. Then, literally the day after I talked to Sarah, Catie told me another story had been pulled by management, and she thought she was gonna get fired for making a stink about it. I mean, this was huge. I talked to Catie about how if that happened, there had to be proof of it. Something legitimate that could go into the story and be disseminated according to Alaskan consent law. Then I got a text from Catie.
So I just got fired because I wouldn't cover up a story. In 24 hours, this number will not be any good to you.
And pretty soon there was irrefutable proof that something was rotten at KSRM.
Do what you want, but I will not put my name on another story, and I won't have my name on the website, and I will not be connected to any of it.
At all?
Nope. What other option do I have at this point?
Well, I'm just curious as to where you're coming from with it. I understand.
No association with the way that this company chooses to do news, because it's now evident this isn't just a John thing. This isn't just a one-off. This is a deep issue that every level of management in this company, except for me, agrees with. That we will pick and choose news based on money. This is every level except for me.
So no resolution. Then there's no way beyond.
Are you going to publish the Mills story, the Zimmerman story, and the Litke story?
No, we're beyond that, over and done.
Well, that's the only resolution I see at this point, because I'm not dealing with one issue. If this was one issue, Litke was one issue. Zimmerman was, this keeps happening 3 times is a pattern.
Okay, well, then that's where we have to end it. I'm gonna need your phone, your key, and you will have. We'll take care of everything else here within 72 hours.
I'd like 24 hours to get my stuff off of that phone.
Okay. Need the key, though.
I'll clear out my office.
Holy shit. Catie was fired for refusing to cover up a story. This was indisputable, Catie was a hero, and I had what I needed to write the alternative story. I got into the liquor cabinet that night to celebrate the glory of this achievement, and I stayed up talking to Catie until my phone died.
I'm telling you, this is God.
I mean, it's flat written in the Bible that there is only one accuser, and that's Satan.
Mm-hmm.
After that, I was adding new details to my article, and Catie was packing her bags. She'd made the spontaneous decision to leave the peninsula behind while deciding on her next move, which I supported.
You're gone tomorrow?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay. Where is this journey taking you then?
Well, so tomorrow I'm hitching a ride to Anchorage with some friends. We'll spend the day in Anchorage. Then I fly to Seattle on a red-eye. Then I bus to Vancouver, stay there a night, and then bus back to Seattle. And then I have a ticket to Hawaii. And then that's as far as I got. Like, well, Hawaii's not a bad place to figure out your next move.
No, I think it's probably the perfect place to figure out your next move.
Yeah.
Everything was perfectly normal for a while, and Vermillion was receding into a story about these systems in Alaska that were falling into an abyss of corruption that was becoming more and more obvious. And I had inside information, right? And, sometimes people scoffed at it, and I would think, what do you know? Because I might have an encyclopedia that's more reliable than any source on planet Earth. So who cares what you think? And I just went on a crusade until... The turning point was that Catie called me in a panic from Hawaii, and she asked me to delete the tape of our last conversation. And I thought our last conversation was totally pedestrian, and it was weird to me that Catie would be worried about anything she had told me at that point. We talked all the time. I didn't know what was going on, and then I heard myself say something like, I said I wasn't gonna delete the tapes again last time. In my memory, there was nothing unusual about the conversation that preceded this, but at the same time, I knew that call wasn't about nothing.
I don't know if I ever told you this, but when I first approached him, I didn't know his story. I knew his story, but I didn't know his story from him or his family. So I approached him and I was like, look, I am a bad journalist for this, but I'm never going to make this a story, and I'm going to fight for you in every way I know how. And I've talked to everyone. I've talked to the governor. I've talked to Senator Sullivan. I've talked to Senator Murkowski. I've talked to Congressman Young. I've talked to Senator Nikiski. I've talked to Senator Coghill. I've talked to, I can keep going down the list, Representative Newman.
What Catie is talking about here is leveraging the political influence she gained as a reporter and attempting to get Paul exonerated.
I think that was a year ago. It's just hilarious to me because he cared less about being exonerated at the moment.
Back when this was recorded, a year ago represented a time before Paul was sentenced on a single manslaughter charge. How did I miss that?
The governor knows Paul's name because I made sure that the governor knew Paul's name because I was pretty furious about all this in the beginning. Yeah. The governor's the one who signs off on those things, so there's a good possibility. Nikiski knows Paul's name very well. Nikiski went and met Paul at my request. Nikiski is fairly popular at the state level. It's right there. It's right there. Yeah.
A murderer was visited by a sitting senator before they got off with a slap on the wrist. I don't know how to emphasize this appropriately, but nothing made sense, so imagine that nothing made sense. This was a lot to process. I thought about the story I'd been working on prior to meeting Catie.
Well, I don't think there was anybody here who had any doubt that Vermillion was guilty.
And what I was working on at the moment.
It's just it's so irrelevant. No one will love you less if you write a bad article.
There was also this seemingly innocuous detail in the tape, but it got bigger. It was echoing around in my mind.
Vermillions are the best hikers, and they have my dog right now, and they have my dog right now, and they have my...
You'd have to know someone pretty well to watch their dog while they were on an indefinite hiatus, right? So in the face of this evidence, what do? I guess you source your goddamn story and you sit with the reality. And there really isn't an option B. A reporter named Megan Pacer, who'd worked at the Clarion, had attended a few hearings with Catie. And she told me a story that started with a letter Catie had sent to Genghis's mother, asking her to forgive Paul.
Yeah. But yeah, that's not what we should be doing as reporters. Thanks for letting me know. I'm not going to do anything with this, but I appreciate you telling me. That's the one thing I remember really, really well. And as it went on, she was just always talking to them. I was like, this is weird. This is not professional. This is not, she's clearly biased. And then her bias was showing through the reporting, and I just remember feeling, and I think at one point someone told me she was Oh no, like I was in the hallway and I remember like someone in the family said like, okay, should we like go back to the hotel now? And like it was very clear that Catie was going with them. And I was like, whoa.
Paul Vermillion was guilty of murder 1. That's the crime he committed.
That happened.
If the jury wasn't convinced by the intent implicit with the second gun, Paul was guilty of murder 2, and one of those charges was murder with extreme indifference, which would weigh on your mind if you were privy to the crime scene. He committed murder.
I know that. Trust me, I know that.
If you were able to eat lunch, view the crime scene, and rest at the conclusion that what happened was in the stand your ground zone. I mean, the stand your ground zone is bullshit, but if that's where you landed, I just want you to know that you're not Christian, you don't care about Christ, and there is nothing about you that is honest. There is no such thing as an intellectual argument that Paul committed manslaughter. That's absurd.
I mean, it's right there. It's right there.
And then in the abyss of meaningless absurdity, there was an explanation that contained elements of a narrative you already know.
Yep.
This is Rasha McChesney. She was working in public radio when I found her, but she cut her teeth at the Peninsula Clarion. And this was while Catie was being installed as news director at KSRM.
I've also heard from another reporter, from a radio reporter there, about a FOIA getting canceled that had to do with, again, something completely different, but this was the police canceling a FOIA. And these things were like totally independent. It sort of set up something off in my head.
It wasn't a female radio reporter, was it?
I'm sure you probably know who it was.
I'm also spacing on her name.
Catie Quinn.
Yeah. So your story is your story, man, but Catie I would not rely on her as a source. How do I put this politely?
When I got Rasha on the phone in 2018, I didn't know. I honestly didn't know until she said what she said. And then it was like, oh yeah, obviously.
I investigated her for quite some time while I was there, which caused us to clash. She was a member of a group that I would call a cult in Nikiski, which is pretty close by, and was sort of using her position as a reporter at the local commercial radio station to do some things that I found sort of problematic for a person who calls himself a reporter to do.
I would say the thing that you're talking about was brought up to me by a lawyer who said it in passing when I was like, hey, Catie told me this. And this is a guy who's a lawyer in the area said, she's involved in some weird sex cult or something.
That is exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Did you ever do any, reporting that reached the news desk about this?
About the cult?
The cult thing.
No, that's one of my greatest regrets of my career, is not managing to get that story out before I left the paper. I still have all of this tape. Photos and interviews and all sorts of stuff, and I just did not manage to do that before I got out of there.
No way.
Yeah.
The truth was actually bonkers to a degree that being wrong about Catie was kind of interesting.
I'm actually not entirely sure how Catie wound up in it. I don't know if she, followed it from,
a reporter
right? Not
standpoint?
New Zealand, Australia, yeah. So, I don't know if she, met them when she came here and joined, or came straight here to join them. Because she went to some kind of, online, I don't know. She doesn't have a journalism degree. She definitely has, a Bible degree in something.
I got a hint that there were receipts for all this tucked inside a divorce case from 2015. And that turned out to be the case.
Are you currently employed locally?
Yes, sir. I'm the news director of a local radio group.
And which radio station?
KSRM.
A youth what?
I'm sorry?
I didn't get the title.
KSRM.
No,
Oh, sorry.
The job title.
News director.
News director.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
And are you part of the fellowship of the body or the people or the group that's sometimes referred to as sought out?
Yes, sir, I am.
You do kind of have to account for the nutty here, and also understand that just because someone's a little bonkers because they're not getting enough sunlight doesn't mean they're wrong. And I think that's something I didn't learn until I got to Alaska. People who you would normally discount in a larger market as just being totally off their rocker. Up here, you just encounter so many people like that you come to sort of ignore the parts of them that are a little wacky and just pay attention to the substance of what they're saying.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times, they're not wrong.
Hey, so I want to let you go here. I do want, if at all possible, is there any way you could give me like an overview of what the sex cult thing was without mentioning names or whatever? Just what the general idea of that was? It seems like impossible in such a small community.
That is totally my story. You cannot have it.
Knowing what you know about me, how do you think I responded to this?
No.
I would be glad to give you a broad overview.
Okay, thank you. Oh, come on. I got brainwashed. What's the cult story?
Basically, there is this guy, and the reason I got connected with this, so there's this guy who I think lives in Hawaii now, who moved to Nikiski, and I don't really know exactly what ties he had there.
So there's this guy named Marc Wade Bisset who got involved in something that was none of his business. Mark is a preacher with some, I don't know, he's got weird ideas.
That's the first thing Jesus ever preached. Sex.
The thing you should know about Mark is that he descended into hell and beat up Satan, and then he took back a few sins for his followers to enjoy. And that's the story, at least, and it created some chaos.
You don't deny that you stated that, in fact, you descended into hell and had a physical altercation with Satan that you won.
Now you're bringing religion back into it again. No, I engaged in many, every year, extended fasts.
And one occurred this past fall, correct? Did you come back from that claiming to members of the body that you were actually bruised?
Excuse me. That was a spiritual encounter, and that's very sacred to me.
Spiritual or physical, or both?
That is a religious, spiritual encounter, and I'm not talking about my religion like that. That's very personal, it's very sacred, and it's mine personally, and it's not to be expressed publicly.
All right, thank you so much for listening. I'm so happy that you made it the whole way. It's incredible. The rabbit hole, if you want to keep going, is at patreon.com/cult stories. That's how you support the show. That's where the next episode is forming. It's how you can get in touch with me, and it's where you can see into the future. It's legitimately its own entity. Patreon.com/cult stories. If you're curious about what you've heard, but you're not sure you're ready to dive into the Patreon, that's fine. You can find me on TikTok at Syran Warner. Syran is spelled Syran, Warner like Warner Brothers. I'm pretty easy to find. I'm the only Syran on planet Earth, so that helps. The Instagram is Cult Stories. The website is cultstories.com. This is all very easy. My personal Instagram, if you're a voyeur, that's at Free Melissa Parker. Remember Melissa Parker?
I'm here to tell my story.
If you want to buy me a drink at the CC Club, the Venmo is just at Cult Stories. I appreciate it. If you're interested in the music that you heard in this episode, I have made a playlist that is, just go on Spotify and look up Cult Stories. It's a playlist. Otherwise, I would just say that you can Google the cult. It's called The Body, and there's a ton of information out there already, because I've been doing this a long time. I'm so grateful for you. This has been a very interesting experience, and I'm thankful you were with me this whole time. You know, the two sets of footprints and then one set of footprints. Jesus, that stuff. I'm going to leave you with the idea that people can change, and that's really the only thing you can actually count on. So, yeah, next time on Cult Stories.
So tell me, what you're married?
Well, kind of. Drama being drama, there was never an actual ceremony or vows or rings or name or anything like that because we were in a cult, and cults don't like people actually being attached to each other. They like to keep all the control for themselves.
Yeah.
So we ended up forging an application for marriage license because he wanted to move because the cult had... God, it's such a long story, man.
Yeah.